You disturb me! You cannot go on or keep ringing my bell!
It seems like every other month, the discussion over race swapping revives itself. Last time it was Snow White, and now it's the casting for Astrid. But while many peeps are quick to call this some woke liberal garbage, an analysis of Asian men in cinema demonstrates a clearer picture of what race swapping really promotes. Because while discussions over race swapping and the desexualization of Asian men have been long addressed, crucial questions have yet to be answered. Like who benefits from desexualizing Asian men, and how do men of Asian descent across cinema and film access sexuality when constantly depicted as romantically undesirable? The answer is supplementation, the addition of whiteness into yellow and brownness. But before we get too ahead of ourselves, let's discuss the desexualization of Asian men, how race swapping fits into all this, and whether race swapping is really some woke garbage after all. Ignoring stupid propaganda nonsense about Asian men having micropeens, movies and shows typically depict yellow and brown dudes as asexual losers. Now, hear me out. Maybe that's because the Asian dudes willing to play racist minstrel caricatures are actual fucking losers.
If we were poor, Papa, we would be divorced because there's no way you know how to show me love.
What?
But even beyond stereotypes, for those cast as prominent characters or protagonists, tell me why they were never able to access a relationship. For example, why was Raj from Big Bang Theory the only nerd without a partner? And why didn't Han get to kiss Trish at the end of Romeo Must Die? Oh wait, they did kiss at the end. Except it was cut from the film because test audiences watching got sick to their stomach seeing an Asian man achieve sexual desirability and interracial relationships depicted on screen. What the fuck? But instead of crashing out and molding, let's take a more nuanced approach and explore the history behind Asian male desexualization. Believe it or not, men of Asian descent weren't always depicted as sexless nerds. In fact, one of Hollywood's first male sex symbols was a Japanese dude named Sessue Hayakawa. And Sessue was so popular, he often had Western women swooning for him, even though he was constantly typecast into playing sexually perverted villains. And since America didn't take fondly to Asian immigrants in the past, many viewed Asian men as a threat to Western society, especially as Eastern immigrants who were paid less than their Western counterparts often found employment over white laborers demanding higher salaries during times of recession. Thus, the media resorted to accusing their Asian peers of being dangerous yellow perils, responsible for stealing American jobs from deserving white citizens, leading to the ruin of the country's economy. Which is why Hayakawa, despite having immense clout as an actor, was forced into playing villains hell-bent on dominating Western women. By the way, if you want a more in-depth explanation of the yellow peril stuff, you can watch in my first video. But to minimize the threat of Asian men that they themselves constructed, America took action with a combination of various hard and soft measures. For hard measures, these include tangible acts such as passing multiple laws meant to limit and repress Asian Americans. Laws such as the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882, the Immigration Act of 1917, and the Johnson and Reed Act, otherwise known as the Asian Exclusion Act of 1924, were all legalized to directly prohibit immigration from Asia, while domestic laws such as segregation and the Hays Code were used to tangibly repress Asians and marginalized communities currently existing in the US via racial separation and the prohibition of interracial relations. And with further need to antagonize Asian countries during the Cold War against communism and to justify the conflicts in Vietnam and Korea, after World War II forced many to acknowledge the immorality of racial and ethnic discrimination, the United States shifted from more overt forms of racism to many softer measures, such as mass racial stereotyping and propaganda, which depicted Asian men as evil foreign monsters or passive sexist losers, simultaneously villainizing them while delegitimizing their romantic appeal. Unfortunately, these past depictions have led to real-world effects today. As stated in the book America on Film, representing race, class, gender, and sexuality at the movies, marginalized groups in film can be subject to instant characterization through pre-existing social and cultural stereotypes, meaning that on-screen depictions often instantaneously casted minorities as existing social caricatures rather than nuanced human beings. And these characterizations may seem benign, but examples of casting Asian dudes as mysterious mobsters or Hispanics as gang members can have vast effects on how those identified as Asian or Hispanic are treated outside the movie house. Which is why even though it's been over a century since Hayakawa's peak, he is still the most substantial Asian sex symbol in Western cinema despite having been banned from kissing his co-stars and completely forgotten from Hollywood history, as Asian actors after him have been unable to escape being cast as stereotypes. And while you might be quick to suggest that things have improved, the consequences of measures used to delegitimize Asian men still have substantial effects today. Because even though the Hays Code preventing the depiction of romance between interracial actors was lifted in 1968, in case y'all have already forgot, Han still didn't get to kiss Trish at the end of Romeo Must Die, filmed 2 generations later, and the majority of Asian actors on screen are still primarily depicted as sexless losers. And that's just the soft effects of social discrimination. the tangible consequences are just as real. Because if you take a look at dating statistics, Asian men are by far the least desirable racial group among women in America. According to published stats from dating app OkCupid, where 0% would represent neither negative nor positive preference, Asian men as a group are rated the lowest by all races outside of their own, at negative 11% by black women, negative 16% by Latina women, and negative 12% by white women. Comparatively, they are also the least positively preferred by women of their own race at 10% preference from Asian women, compared to black women preferring men of their own race at 16%, Latina women at 11%, and white women at 17%. By the way, I'd cite this shit, but OkCupid deliberately deleted the statistical analysis after revealing how racist the dating preferences of their users were, so yeah, there's only fragmented screenshots of this stat left. However, another study conducted by Oxford in 2011, examining over 6,000 heterosexual profiles on the most popular dating site at the time, found similar results, conveying that on aggregate, women of all races, even Asian women themselves, demonstrate a strong preferential bias against Asian men, greater than any other races. More specifically, while both the studies published by Oxford and the one done by OkCupid demonstrate a large bias against Asian men, the former demonstrates that Asian women are significantly less likely to prefer their own race, while simultaneously excluding their own race significantly higher than women of any other group. So it's both statistically and historically evident that men of Asian descent are significantly less desirable than men of any other race. Also, quick tangent, but it was very fucking annoying researching stats for this because motherfuckers in academia want to operate in some black-white binary bullshit and just pretend like other people of color don't exist. Which explains why AP to representation isn't just lacking in cinema, but also in academic research, making it not only very difficult to identify and solve our issues, but substantially more simple to just ignore our struggles. And this binary is the same reason why race swaps from white to colored folks tend to primarily change white women to black women, but I'll explain more about this in part 4. Additionally, while Asian men are statistically the least desirable, it's quite evident that white men are the most desirable across the board. And I wonder why. Firstly, unlike the white supremacists who will claim it's because white people are genetically superior, if that was the case, then women on aggregate wouldn't prefer peeps of their own race to white people. Secondly, and more accurately, maybe, just hear me out, maybe it's because fucking film didn't depict all white men as disgusting monsters for literal decades! Obviously, if you're gonna depict marginalized men as stereotyped villains hellbent on abusing women and destroying America, we're gonna have a horrible rep from people of all races outside of our own. And this truth is pretty evident because the reason people tend to romantically prefer their own race is likely due to the fact that they're familiar with folks of their own culture, and thus less likely in subscribing to racist antagonism against their marginalized community. Also, guess what? Remember how I said we were gonna ignore discussing the micro-peen stuff earlier? Well, I lied. We're talking about penises. I'm not gonna get too into it because then I'd just be reading a bunch of numbers from dozens of medical studies. So if y'all want to read all that, I'll drop a great link to a Reddit post on it in the description. But the general gist is that the average penile size is pretty standard among all races. In fact, according to a systemic review of 20 studies with over 15,000 participants, it was determined impossible to draw any conclusions that penile size differed between races. So despite what online consensus may suggest, men of Asian descent do not have smaller dicks, and BBC is as a result also not real. But it should be obvious that consensus doesn't reflect reality, because if it did, then 7% of Americans wouldn't believe that chocolate milk comes from brown cows, and myths like searing your meat to lock in the juices wouldn't exist.
When meat is seared, the Maillard effect does create a bunch of tasty flavors, but it doesn't lock in juices.
So despite being false, why then does this stereotype that Asian dudes have smaller dicks exist? Well, if you've caught on to the theme of this video, then the answer is obviously anti-Asian propaganda meant to desexualize men of Asian descent. In fact, the one study used to buttress this myth was conducted on a small sample of 123 Korean men, concluding that they had an average penile size of 3.8 inches. However, what anti-Asian propagandists often forget to mention is that this study measured penises by stretching the foreskin while participants were flaccid, meaning that results weren't ever accurate to actual penis sizes if the men had actually been hard. Plus, if we're to believe that flaccid measurements are determinant of hardened length, then according to an institutional study measuring the flaccid penile length of white men, the average white penile size is 9.4 centimeters or 3.7 inches, meaning that white dicks are 0.1 inch shorter than Asian dicks. So to any angry white dudes watching, before you start wilding in my comments, please spare me that small dick energy. Listen, the facts do not care about your feelings, okay? It's not my fault y'all don't have big dick energy like me. Also, I'm starting to really sidetrack here, but white dudes be hella weird about marginalized genitals, especially black dicks. I'm not even gonna get into it because that's way beyond my comfort and expertise, but I just wanted to mention it because I know it's a thing. So if you're curious why Asian men are desexualized across media and film, then the stats earlier on dating preferences describe a clear benefactor. White people are the sole beneficiaries of perpetuating stereotypes against marginalized communities. I talked about this a bit during my Outrage video, but I'll reiterate here. It's a lot easier to tear others down than to build yourself up, especially in the case of romance, as dating and relationships are intrinsically viewed as competitive. And since most peeps are monogamous, once a person's in a relationship, they're then off the market. Thus, rather than competing against colored folks for potential partners on an even playing field, white people have created a structure that demonizes and stereotypes the colored, continually buttressing that system to this day, swaying the balance of desirability permanently in their corner before colored folks ever had a chance. And the easiest method to accomplish this is by constantly spreading the image of marginalized people as romantically undesirable and lesser than. We've already discussed that continually depicting negative imagery of Asian men through instant characterization harms them, but it also buttresses white supremacy. Because beyond prescribing stereotypical characterizations to minorities and causing them to be viewed as such, these repeated representations also contribute to normalizing white supremacy. And though the media has gotten less overt in their racism, while current media portrayals are more subtle, they still perpetuate the same ideas, which is why all yellow criminals are labeled evil commies, brown lawbreakers are all terrorists, black people are all thugs, while white offenders get to be mentally ill lone wolves. So when men of Asian descent are desexualized, it basically aids all those who aren't Asian by giving Asian men artificial attributes that dissuade others from dating them, presenting others a negative bias towards Asian men and preventing them from accessing women before they've ever had a chance to represent themselves. Therefore, it's very obvious that a lot of the shit presented on TV about Asian dudes today have been rooted in negative depictions of Asian men from the past for the purpose of neutering them. But if depictions of Asian men in cinema are so harmful, then why did men of Asian descent play them in the first place? Like, isn't it kind of dumb to play a character that you know will make your life harder? Well, unlike the sellouts today, you can't really pin the blame on peeps of Asian descent. Because believe it or not, most of the actors who originally depicted Asian stereotypes weren't Asian. While I'm pretty sure many of our introductions to the online outrage over race swapping started with the announcement of the live-action Little Mermaid, the act of race swapping itself has been a thing for a while. Because rather than peeps of color replacing white folks, race swapping started with white peeps portraying the colored. Historically, the American roots of this act likely began at 19th century minstrelsy, where white performers would don blackface to portray racist stereotypes for the leisure of white audiences, which again, y'all can get a better explanation for in my criticisms of a current day example of it in my Outrage video. But outside of its roots in yellow and blackface, once white actors portraying caricatured minorities started getting a bit of flack for, I don't know, being fucking racist, they slowly began dialing back their overt racism into more covert forms, going from outright black and yellow face to more subtle facial cosmetics, utilizing cultural appropriation, and then entirely rewriting colored characters as white or removing cultural signifiers from marginalized personas to appeal to a white audience. And this entire process can be identified broadly as the act of whitewashing still occurring to this day. Because while you'd imagine that whitewashing primarily happened in films like The Hatchet Man, created all the way back in the 1930s, films like Bullet Train, replacing Asian characters with white ones made as recently as 2022, proved that whitewashing is still a large method utilized to appeal to whiteness in Western countries. More specifically, we can use the concentration and date of such films to highlight the transition from yellowface to white replacement discussed earlier. While the first examples of yellowface likely occurred in theater plays, we can see occurrences of this act donned by white cinema stars in silent films like Broken Blossoms as early as 1919. And this practice transitioned prominently into color and sound films seen in The Tea House of the August Moon, The Good Earth, and Breakfast at Tiffany's. However, after the civil rights movement, while overtly racist depictions went out of style, occurrences of this have still transpired, as seen in Season 9 of How I Met Your Mother, filmed in 2013. That said, despite its continued existence, yellowface has largely been replaced via whitewashing. So rather than literally coloring an actor's face, whitewashing still aims to position a white actor in an Asian role in other forms. But rather than claiming these characters as Asian, they are instead labeled as white, opting to shift the race of the persona while maintaining all previous cultural aspects of its original source. And this trend can be seen in multiple films over the last decade, such as Ghost in the Shell, Doctor Strange, various Batman movies, and M. Night Shyamalan's Avatar movie that doesn't actually exist. In all these instances, characters who are originally of Asian descent are not only portrayed by white actors and racially declared as such, but simultaneously preserve the same cultural clothing and signifiers of the original character's Asian origins, which is basically the definition of cultural appropriation, by the way. Anyway, while whitewashing didn't get as much backlash as yellowface, it still received pushback. Thus, after what I assume is them getting tired of being repeatedly called out for erasing minorities, casting directors probably had the bright idea of, wait a minute, let's just replace these motherfuckers. Then they can't say shit. Which finally leads us to the modern equivalent of full-on race swaps that can be seen in more recent films such as Death Note, Bullet Train, and Netflix's Three Body Problem, all filmed in 2017, 2022, and 2024 respectively. And rather than keeping any aspect of Asianness seen in yellowface and whitewashing, in an act to avoid any backlash for doing peeps of Asian descent dirty by erasing any links to Asianness itself, Asian characters are just straight up replaced with white ones, having all Asianness swept under the rug. And guess what? These decisions probably paid off, because outside of an angry minority, most people don't care and barely have even noticed. I mean, we all probably saw those videos or tweets of people justifying hating on films for changing white characters to colored ones and claiming that their position is fair because they oppose all forms of race swapping. But outside of acknowledging that blackface occurred in the past, these homies will have you believe that nowadays race swapping only exists through blackwashing. Because while researching for this video, I've seen many YouTube videos covering the history of race swapping, disagreeing with the concept as a whole, and openly bashing modern days examples of it where characters are swapped from white to colored, and then proceeding to leave out any forms of whitewashing past the 1970s. And it's even worse on Twitter, where people can be seen crashing out and peddling the notion that race swapping today primarily exists for diversity points, in instances where characters go from white to black. Which would be very apparently false, as the examples earlier have shown that marginalized characters are still being erased up until 2025. However, in case you might have noticed, or literally didn't, because that's the entire point, no one gave a fuck about any of these characters getting whitewashed despite it happening for literal decades. I mean, where is the mass outcry against changing the race of Talia al Ghul's character from Chinese Arab to white? Yeah, that's what I thought. None of y'all gave a fuck. And these filmmakers will tell you with a straight face that their casting decisions aren't an appropriation of Asian culture, while denying that whitewashed characters could have just stayed Asian if they were gonna steal everything else. After all, they'll say it's just a coincidence that the white actors got their makeup done to look more Asian, happen to exist in a place where everyone else is Asian, wear all the same clothes from Asian culture, participate in multiple arts from Asia, and have an Asian name, all while simultaneously being white and not appropriating culture the whole time. Total coincidence, dude. So yeah, whitewashing has been happening for decades, but the white supremacists throwing a fit at the film not being 100% the same as the source materials won't even say a peep. But you know what does get their nipples in a twist? When white characters are later switched to colored ones. Nowadays, if you hear people complaining about race swapping, it's almost certainly from some Twitter user losing their shit about how a fictional white character's role was given to a biracial woman who is white. What the fuck? And these folks will not only bash the film and claim there's a woke agenda for diversity, but even go as far as insulting the attractiveness of marginalized actors as if a 12-year-old character was supposed to be hot. So citing examples like Annabeth, Amber, Ariel, and Astrid, I don't know why all their names start with an A, by the way. There's probably a separate video to make about that. But let's be real, did any of these race swaps really change the story? Like, I'm pretty sure all these films involve literal magic powers and dragons, so if y'all can suspend your disbelief about aliens shooting power beams, why would a previously white character being black take you out of immersion so vividly? In my opinion, it's likely because the white peeps who are vehemently opposed to diverse inclusion, claiming that it doesn't do anything, actually care a lot about representation, as any shift from marginalized to white goes unnoticed, while white characters getting played by a biracial woman will trigger conspiracy theories about some great replacement. And I get that in certain instances, it sticks out like a sore thumb when a character from Norse history like a Viking is played by a black actor, but it's just as apparent whenever a white actor is put in ancient Asia wearing cultural robes surrounded by like 50 Asian dudes. However, while showing these examples on screen makes crappy race swaps very obvious, there's another form of whitewashing that I purposely left out. A more invisible method which still operates on the same intentions of promoting white supremacy while desexualizing Asian men at the same time. And this process that I call racial supplementation occurs through the addition of whiteness to yellow and brownness. It's finally time to talk about white supplementation. But before I get into it, I want to make something very clear. Listen up, because this shit is very important. Asian people who are multiracial are still Asian people. Say it with me now. Asian people who are multiracial are still Asian people. Okay, great. With this understood, I do not want to see any debates over some blood quantum bullshit in my comment section. Alright, let's proceed. So I've already talked about how white men ultimately benefit from desexualizing Asian men, and how racial caricatures are used to validate white patriarchal supremacy, but as y'all are probably aware, not all Asian men have been completely desexualized in Western cinema. While there aren't many, there are some examples of Asian male love interests who are presented as both romantically desirable and attractive, like Nick Young in Crazy Rich Asians. So obviously, Asian men are still represented as sexually desirable despite being unable to achieve white adjacency, right? No. Because while depictions of the Asian protagonist seen in Crazy Rich Asians probably does more harm than good, and the actor portraying Nick is surely a cutie patootie, this homie's white, bro. Henry Golding is a biracial Asian and white man. So the message presented by these characters isn't that men of Asian descent are sexually viable, but that men of Asian descent are only romantically desirable if they also happen to be white. Now, before y'all accuse me of being too lost in the sauce, hear me out. This is not just cherry picking, cause hella Asian male romantic leads in Hollywood are not just Asian, they're also white. Literally. I just mentioned it earlier, but the dude from Crazy Rich Asians is white. Both Asian dudes from Doja Cat and Taylor Swift's music videos, they're white. Actual racist, anti-white Japanese supremacist Tengen from Blue Eye Samurai, voiced by an Asian dude who is white. The two romance protagonists from Shanghai Calling and Moxie, homies are white. Mark from Invincible, dude is white. I mean, Jordan from Gen V, who literally has the power to change genders, is played by two Wasian actors, despite both their parents being biologically monoracially Asian. Like, how the fuck is that even possible? So unless Compound V has race-changing abilities to make its users genetically white, this shit literally makes no sense. Now, I'm aware that not all Asian male romance leads happen to also be white, but the fact that I can list 8 examples from the top of my head, all from notable films, is insane. And this list isn't even exhaustive, because I had like 2 more examples before writing the script that I forgot to include. So trust me, this is not a conspiracy, but legitimate evidence of whiteness being used to supplement Asianness in media as a method of allowing men of Asian descent to achieve sexual and romantic desirability within Western cinema and film. By the way, I'm going to emphasize this again, but it's very important that I make this clear. I have no issues with any of these actors portraying the characters that they did. All of the characters I have just mentioned were portrayed by people of Asian descent, and I do not think that any of them are less racially or culturally Asian because they also happen to be white. Actors act for a living, so it would be fucked up to expect Asian actors to not take on the limited roles that they're already given, especially those that push progress for Asian peeps. So I completely understand and support these actors in their choices to play the characters that they did. However, why the fuck did casting directors specifically choose out men of Asian descent who also happen to be white? None of the Asian peeps in these films deserve any hate, but these casting directors are definitely catching hands, because as the evidence shows, their choices are likely a result of white peeps validating the value of whiteness while continuing trends of Asian emasculation. As based on a study conducted on 25 films created after 1993, featuring at least one significant Asian lead or supporting character, it was found that out of all directors, 4 were Asian while 23 were white. Also, just for your knowledge, there are hundreds of thousands of Asian actors, many times more than Asian American actors, and there are thousands of Asian American actors, many times more than Asian actors who are also white. Because Asian people are only 0.9% of the American population. So you cannot convince me that these casting directors aren't explicitly choosing out Asian men with genetic connections to whiteness. Thus, whether it was done subconsciously or not, it's very clear that Asian men are not allowed access to attractiveness in media unless doing so also buttresses the desirability of white men. And in analyzing the role that biracial characters often play in films, we get evidence to suggest this as Hollywood filmmakers cast biracial actors in lead roles as a tactic to present a diverse face while simultaneously reproducing positive representations of whites and negative representations of racial others. Meaning that regardless of whether these casting choices were intended or not, whiteness remains exalted and preserved while otherness is diluted and sanitized. And in the specific example of Henry Golding being cast as the lead in Crazy Rich Asians, he was likely chosen for his roles for the same reasons, as he both fulfills Western conventions of beauty in his British heritage while supplying an Asian heritage that is simultaneously authentic and exotic. And like Golding, I'd suggest that most Wasian actors who find themselves chosen for a lead romance role over monoracial Asian peeps were selected not just because of their acting skills, but likely due to them being white enough to be acceptable and Asian enough to be an asset. Plus, this shit isn't just limited to Western countries, as the influence of American hegemony garnered post-Cold War has spread globally. For example, people in non-English countries are aware that Trump is the US president, while I didn't even know 5 of the leaders in Europe. And beyond political reach, the cultural effects of American hegemony have spread too, especially in many Asian countries, as the US has literally militarily occupied many of them, such as Japan, the Philippines, and South Korea. Which is why despite heavy discrimination against white mixed race people in the post-war Korea, there is now a prevalence of whiteness as a marker of desirable otherness in contemporary Korean popular culture. And in case you think it's just a result of increased global interconnectedness, rather than perpetuating a specific desire for whiteness over color, the popularity of white mixed-race celebrities in Korea is distinct from the treatment received by other mixed-race Koreans, which demonstrates white supremacy in contemporary Korean popular culture. Also, this is semi-related and kind of a sidetrack, but whiteness in media depicting marginalized men isn't just perpetuated with multiracial male leads in romance films being white, cause who they're also paired with matters too. And maybe I'm just overthinking things, but tell me why a lot of these films with marginalized men as the main characters typically have these homies paired with some white chick. Which, if you go galaxy brain about it, kind of conveys the suggestion that colored men who save the world or accomplish heroic deeds are then awarded the opportunity to breed out of marginalization via their future descendants being racially whitened. Which, beyond objectifying women as objects and trophies to reward protagonists with for their actions, once again positions whiteness as the most desirable achievement one can attain. So this is some racial bullshit, dude. And even though race isn't real because it's just a socially constructed concept, and I myself don't have any personal experience with this as a monoracial homie, let's not fucking pretend that biracial or multiracial peeps of white ancestry do not benefit from colorism and featureism. Obviously, this stuff is very complicated because how someone's phenotypic features presents isn't always accurate to both halves of their parents. So please keep in mind that the benefits a person of multiracial white ancestry gets from their whiteness can range from literally nothing to full-on white passing. Plus, it's not all rainbows and roses, as many multiracial peeps feel disconnected and isolated from their racial identity, likely exacerbated by monoracial peeps not accepting them. So I remind you again, please do not start some race quantum bullshit in my comment section. I will pin your comment and publicly shame you. Getting back on topic now, another reason these decisions were made might also be due to public shielding. While this was noted a bit in the paper explaining how biracial characters are used to present a diverse front while buttressing whiteness, it likely works practically to prevent critics from discussing multiracial casting choices with nuance and depth. As most people who are going to criticize films with biracial actors playing an originally moniracial minority aren't going to use the care and nuance appropriate to hold these conversations needed to prevent triggering mass racial infighting that goes literally nowhere. And even being as careful as I am to validate the Asian identity of multiracial Asian peeps, I know for a fact someone watching this video is going to wrongfully interpret my message and use it as justification to perpetuate further antagonism against multiracial Asian peeps, no matter how carefully I construct this essay. Which is why movie higher-ups can pretty much always count on communal infighting over the acceptance of multiracial peeps as a convenient way for them to just pretend as if there's contention over whether their casting choices are perpetuating white supremacy. As many marginalized peeps will be forced to prioritize defending multiracial actors from racial ignorance and antagonism thrown against them for getting their role, preventing us from ever getting to the core of the issue or even addressing the harmful effects spread by depicting originally colored characters as multiracial and white. And that's because choosing to replace monoracial men of Asian descent with multiracial ones who are white, beyond the evidence we discussed earlier, seeds a two-part idea within yellow and brown audiences, with the initial effect spreading the idea to colored folks that people of white descent are the most desirable of all races, while the subsidiary effect tells yellow and brown dudes that they need to achieve white adjacency to be attractive. Which not only communicates the message to monoracial Asian men that being Asian by nature isn't enough to be desirable, but shows that the only way for them to achieve romantic viability is if they've been bleached by a purified white seed. So people who fall victim to believing this propaganda often find themselves developing an internalized self-hatred towards their race. And this seems especially true for yellow and brown peeps, as we're expected to conform with the model minority myth through achieving all aspects of success. And unfortunately, the biggest marker of success for marginalized people isn't whether they're a good person, wealthy, or their level of education, but their ability to achieve white adjacency and acceptance within the walls of white society. And again, in case it wasn't obvious, if you're a monoracial yellow or brown dude, the message and stereotypes pushed by these Asian male romance films is the notion that Asian men need access to whiteness to obtain desirability, which is literally impossible for them, as the way Asian male romance leads achieved whiteness wasn't through any individual efforts or accomplishments, but through being born white. Therefore, these homies are taught that in achieving myths of mono-minority success shown on TV and outperforming other people of color, they can finally access the white adjacency possessed by many multiracial Asian dudes on screen. And while this access to whiteness is just cruel optimism dangled on a string, since most people consume media for entertainment rather than critically analyzing its messaging, many yellow and brown dudes unknowingly internalize beliefs of marginalized inferiority and white supremacy and end up perpetuating racism towards their own group and other people of color while maintaining the status quo by lifting those in power, while denying equality and opportunity for advancements among those oppressed. Now, I'm sure some people watching this video will think that I'm taking representation a bit too seriously, especially when I was memeing on white peeps getting mad at white characters being spotted with biracial white actors, while simultaneously crashing out over monoracial Asian characters getting played by biracial Asian dudes, but y'all need to hear me out. As hypocritical as it initially sounds, understand that this hypocrisy can only exist in a world that is not functionally run on venerating whiteness. And if you made it this far into the video and have listened to all the evidence I've dropped, I think it's pretty fucking obvious that we live in a world where Western society operates under white supremacy, which by proxy spreads this notion to other nations via Western hegemony. So let me make this very clear. White people in Western society cannot be harmed in the same way minorities are via a lack of representation in film. Because being white has literally been made normal, whereas those marginalized and unable to access whiteness are both otherized as abnormal and constantly dehumanized. Think about it this way. Titanic, which pretty much has an all-white cast, is just considered a movie. You could say it's a romance flick or an adventure film, but at the end of the day, no one considers it a white movie, and it wasn't marketed as one. Crazy Rich Asians, however, is an Asian movie. And even though you could call it a romance or a comedy movie, it's an Asian romance or an Asian comedy simply because of its cast being predominantly Asian. And it was explicitly marketed that way in the West. Similarly, Coco is a Mexican movie and Black Panther is a black movie because of their cast and their cultural themes. However, even though Titanic isn't considered a white movie, it's a fucking white movie. And it's a white movie not just because of its primarily white cast and depictions of Western culture, but also in how it purposely excludes the mention of race as whiteness is normalized and white audiences hate being reminded of race. Because historically, there are plenty of impoverished Black, Indian, and Chinese migrants on the Titanic, so the film could have added the nuance of race on top of gender and class issues, but it purposely didn't to be marketed to white people. So when you next watch the film, be aware of the fact that Jack was able to get the rich girl not just because of his hots and charisma, but because he was fucking white, bro. Ain't no Chinaman sweeping a rich white girl off her feet like that in 1912. Because the Titanic happened over half a century before segregation ended, and homie would have gotten his ass thrown off the boat. So unlike minorities who are forced to constantly consider their race, white people do not have to think about it when going to school, when using the bathroom, going out to approach others, and in moments when they're pulled over by the cops. And especially when they're watching movies. In fact, the only time they seem to actively consider race when it comes to cinema is when a white character is played by a person who's colored. And this brief reminder of race actively pisses them off so much that they leave countless Twitter rants. So when marginalized people have to constantly be aware of how our race affects our lives, how do you think we feel? So please, do not try to tell me that race swapping characters from white to colored is as harmful compared to characters going from colored to white, as white people in the West have all the representation they need both on screen and in real life. Think about it. All the richest CEOs are white, all the most powerful Western politicians are white, all the most famous historical figures are white, and literally every American president except one has been white. And Obama, who's been the only non-white president in US history, is ironically also white, which really ties into the themes of my video more than I intended. But not really, because Obama was born in a more racist period of time where mixed people had to choose a race rather than being accepted as multiracial, so Obama's really just been identified as a black dude his entire life. But again, colorism, featureism, stuff probably played a role in his success, which is why white folks, unlike minorities, do not need as much representation to imagine themselves in similar positions as characters shown on screen, because they've never had any social or racial barriers towards achieving those goals in the first place. And while this video is specific to analyzing the desexualization of men of Asian descent, along with their role in cinema, it should be noted that monoracial characters being replaced with biracial representations on screen isn't just a thing for Asian men, but also happens to many marginalized groups, especially black women who are also mass desexualized and portrayed as romantically undesirable. Plus, more globally, Latin America also tends to favor actors and celebrities with lighter skin, but we can save those conversations for another video. Obviously, just like the previous iterations of whitewashing such as blackface, yellowface, and cultural appropriation, these depictions to supplement whiteness into colored characters represent not only an appeal to white audiences, but tangible perpetuations of white supremacy, pushing the idea of whiteness or white adjacency as universally the most desirable attribute. So in understanding the origins of race swapping, let's discuss contemporary forms of it and break down whether it's really some woke pandering after all. As a resident self-defined woke person who seems to get triggered by 1 in every 5 Instagram reels, my professional opinion is that race swapping is generally not woke. Considering you've watched this video till now, it should be quite obvious that this is the case. So, contrary to what angry conservative dudes online will say, swapping the race of a character from white to colored isn't some secret conspiracy to push a woke agenda onto kids. I mean, what do people even think woke means? Because if we're going by the actual definition of woke, then the term refers to an adjective meaning to be aware of societal issues like race and social justice. So is changing the race of Snow White from a white woman to a multiracial woman who is also white woke because that somehow brings light to larger social issues of systemic racism and oppression? Hell no, bruh. The term woke has just been bastardized from its original meaning and is now being used by conservatives and white supremacists alike to define anything left of wanting to reinstall segregation. So what these mofos online are really pressed about isn't wokeness, but the fight for representation. Which is ironic because those opposing more representation in films are the same people getting actively triggered and threatened when finding out that a white character has even the slightest change to them. And before someone gets pressed and says that changing the race of a character is a big change, for the angry conservative dudes claiming that race swapping is pointless and does nothing for films besides diversity points, if it does nothing, then why are you so mad? And you know what? They should be mad. Now, it might sound wild for me to suggest that some people should be threatened by the spread of diverse representation in film, but if you step in their shoes for a bit and assume that you're a racist who wants white people on top, then you should definitely oppose race swaps from white to colored, as the evidence is conclusive that making these changes is beneficial to marginalized communities. Specifically, while we have witnessed the systemic lack of representation in mainstream film, perpetuating stereotypes and marginalizing unrepresented communities, the benefits of diverse representation in cinema are manifold, as they have the power to foster empathy, challenge stereotypes, and promote understanding across cultural divides. Remember how I explained earlier that white folks don't have an issue imagining themselves in any career or position of power? Well, the marginalized do. Sure, you could make the argument that legally anyone has the same opportunities as others, but not really. If that was the case, then the biggest predictor of being rich wouldn't be being born into wealth, and the laws wouldn't selectively apply to people in power. So while it might be possible for someone like Obama to become president, is it really probable if every other president has been white? And that's why representation matters. Even if we were to assume that the legal structures didn't benefit certain groups over others, that still wouldn't impact social perceptions. Like, tell me 5 political differences between Biden and Harris right now. I really could not even list 3. So if they're so similar politically, then why the fuck did Harris lose when Biden won? Well, if you consider how Harris lost a popular vote despite the Dems owning that shit since 2008, it's probably because she's a black woman. Let's be real. Simply put, there are a decent chunk of the population who cannot imagine a woman in office, let alone a black one. Because the issue isn't minorities taking offense to stereotypes, but how depictions of those stereotypes affect those in a majority and their interactions with marginalized communities. Because you might watch movies in your leisure thinking it doesn't have an effect on you, but if you cry during films like Forrest Gump, then it's clear that movies have a lasting effect on their audiences. For example, if you watch a movie showing the struggles of the impoverished, you might subconsciously be more inclined to humanize the poor. And if you watch a lot of those romance films from the 1940s, then you're probably a sexist. Look, I don't make the rules, okay? It's just how it is. I mean, what the fuck is this, dude?
Daddy, you spanked Mama.
You're darn tootin' I did.
That means you love her.
That's what I've been trying to tell her.
Normalizing domestic abuse against women and children is wild. But as mentioned back in part 1, instant characterization and how minorities are depicted in films can lead to real-life consequences, like how haphazardly displaying a lot of black people as villains make them more likely to be viewed as thugs in real life, which then affects not just perceptions of certain races, but could lead to biases in hiring policies, or social issues preventing people of color from being treated as humans. And if your exposure to Asian Americans is primarily seeing them on screen portrayed as lifeless nerds who lock themselves away to study, then that's what you'll think they are. And if you want a more specific example of poor representation plaguing yellow and brown peeps, then just take a look at affirmative action. While a lot of Asian Americans claim that affirmative action was hurting their college admissions, statistically, it really wasn't. Affirmative action actually benefited all minorities, and the notion that it harmed Asian Americans was conservative propaganda, but we can get into that in another video. For the sake of avoiding argument, let's just assume that either the conservatives are right that affirmative action harmed Asian Americans, or that it at least didn't benefit them if it did anything at all. Well, since affirmative action has been revoked since June of 2023, let's take a look at Asian admission stats, shall we? Surprise, surprise, it fucking went down. Despite the removal of affirmative action, Asian admissions are still ass, and you know why? Representation. While legal and policy crap does play a factor in Asian American admissions, the main issue preventing yellow and brown peeps from admissions has never primarily been a practical issue, it has always been a social one, like being seen as personality-less nerds. After all, Asian stereotypes on screen have reinforced the model minority myth with intelligence as one of their key and only qualities, further disregarding the range of academic experiences and personalities of Asian Americans. So don't be surprised when yellow and brown peeps aren't recognized beyond their test scores. Just think about it. Harvard cannot justify lower Asian admissions despite higher scoring based on race, because that's called racism and they would be sued for it. Instead, Harvard says, while it is notable that Asian test scores are higher than other racial groups, our admissions are holistic and judge many other factors beyond grades, before proceeding to trash a bunch of Asian applicants who they view as lifeless losers. Basically, by using socially accepted ignorant beliefs to assume that Asian Americans only have higher test scores because they spend their life stereotypically studying in their rooms, while people of other races are perceived as having social lives and experiences outside of school, colleges not only avoid getting sued, but justify trashing Asian applicants by using racial stereotypes to reduce their character regardless of how accomplished they are. And knowing all this, can we really say that increased representation should help resolve these issues? Yeah, we can. Going back to diversity within film, in a lot of these examples, not only can race swap characters passively help marginalized audiences see themselves beyond caricatures, but actively improve the characters with added depth and nuance to their backstory and motivations. Great examples of this can be seen in Namor from the second Black Panther film and Isaac from the animated Castlevania series. In both these examples, while the characters were race swapped from their original sources, these reinterpretations actually benefited the film. Examining Namor, the character began as a child of a white sailor and an Atlantean mother. And though there wasn't an initial issue with the design, it gets kinda weird when the character starts beefing with terrestrial humans. Cause if Namor is justified in hating humans like he is in the comics solely due to his Atlantean descent pitting him against land peeps, then there really isn't a reasonable motive for his isolationism, and he's just a bigoted version of Aquaman. Basically, in the OG source material, homie's just a land racist with outright anti-terrestrialism. However, in the movie, Namor is of Mayan descent, and his outlook on humans, while wrong, is understandable. We understand why he's misguided, as he was not only born under the circumstances of his native people being actively genocided and enslaved by Spanish colonizers, but also because he had that view further solidified when he was attacked by conquistadors for trying to bury his mother on land. And Isaac from Castlevania operates similarly. Distinct from the masochistic Dracula-obsessed fanboy in the original games, in the animated series, Isaac's motives in aiding Dracula's extermination of mankind is explained from his past in child slavery. After being raised a slave and later escaping, Isaac was continually harmed and hunted down by those wanting to sell his body for parts throughout his childhood. So after being rescued by Dracula, not only would he feel indebted to the vampire, but it could also be understood why he would hold a deep-seated disdain for humanity, as his entire upbringing was a lesson on the evils of man, while his only kindness came from an individual humanity had deemed a monstrosity. Now give me an example of a character turned white that actually improved the story. Yeah, that's right, you fucking can't. If you take a look at the examples of whitewashing I mentioned earlier, the only changes to those characters were their race, as filmmakers pretty much transitioned all aspects of the culture that the colored character originally possessed to the white one. And in instances where Asian characters were outright replaced, many of them lost their original cultural nuance. So yes, most examples of race swapping that happen from colored to white is just a form of appropriation and culture vulturing, as almost all examples of race swapping marginalized characters in the white one weren't done to improve the characters, but solely as an appeal to please white audiences who claim color blindness while subconsciously demonstrating preference for films with an all-white cast. Of course, apart from examples of white swapping that should be clearly bad by now, swapping the race of white characters into marginalized ones aren't always productive either. Beyond representation for representation's sake, it's just as important how those race swap characters are portrayed and what they do in their films. Cause I'm sure we'd all be cool with a race swap character that added more nuance to the story, but as mentioned before, it's kinda whack seeing colored characters in historical pieces taking place in 11th century Scandinavia. Of course, it's even worse when those characters are portrayed as self-hating white supremacists. And with all the examples of how Asian characters are played by Asians to promote whiteness, if it wasn't clear from the previous parts, race swapping can also be hugely problematic. And akin to how Asian romance leads being white buttresses the message that only whiteness is desirable, marginalized characters can also promote that message through their actions and partnerships. As teased earlier, it might not be obvious till highlighted, but the prevailing shift in race from white characters to colored is typically done to characters who are women, specifically in regards to white women becoming black women. And that's because of the black-white binary, but I'm not going to get into it too much. For the purposes of this video, just be aware that the binary identifies blackness as opposite to whiteness, which explains why filmmakers prefer casting black people for diversity, as doing so is viewed as a greater act of non-whiteness than casting other colored folks. I.e., black people are seen as the most colored of colored people and therefore the most marginalized. Which is obviously some colorist bullshit, but it's pretty concise in explaining why most race swaps for the sake of increasing diversity are done through transforming white women into black ones. Black plus woman equals double whammy intersectionality. You get it, right? The more oppressed, the more diverse, which is why they could add even more layers by making those characters non-binary or disabled and stuff. However, similar to how Asian romance leads are cast to buttress whiteness, while you may think that these race swaps empower women of color, many instances still primarily support the supremacy of white dudes. Especially recognizable in films where the race swap character is involved in romance, it should be noted that while the white women were swapped to another race, the white male leads are never. Ariel is black, but Eric is white. Annabeth is black, but Percy is white. Snow fucking White is allowed to literally not be fully white, but Jonathan is still white. Need I cite more examples? The answer is no, but I'll throw a couple more on screen anyway, just so y'all can get how prevalent this is. The point is, these additions to diversity aren't as woke as some may suggest. And in the example of colored women being cast specifically to be paired with white dudes, it's just some white saviorism crap positioning white men as the only people capable of being heroic and desirable. So if filmmakers really wanted to be transgressive and woke, then Percy Jackson would have been cast as a 5'2" Pakistani dude in a wheelchair. Ultimately, most big budget films are still approved by corporations, and these corporations have a vested interest in preserving the status quo and profit. And unsurprisingly, rich white dudes who got to their position with the help of white supremacy have a vested interest in maintaining racial imbalances. So to no one's shock, even films with changes for diversity still spread the propaganda of white desirability with the added sprinkle of marginalized emasculation. And at this point, we can confidently suggest that these films intentionally promote whiteness, as there's no profit incentive in doing all this whitey bullshit. Specifically, in using observational and experimental data to test the influence of caste racial composition on consumers' perception, their willingness to spread word of mouth, and the film's performance, we find that increasing the number of black actors does not diminish the commercial or artistic appeal, and further, that hiring black actors in leading roles increases both domestic and global sales. Thus, the evidence of persistent discrimination in Hollywood cannot be attributed to the preferences of consumers, but instead reflect bias among employers. And in case this may be a bit confusing, John Foster in The Tricks of the Colorblind Trade summarizes it best by concluding that either employers are acting inefficiently by selecting homogenous cast when the audience prefers diversity, or they are sacrificing money to employ on principle. Basically, this implies not only that diversity in films are a proven benefit to their universal performance, but that filmmakers choosing to employ a primarily white cast are going out of their way to promote white supremacy at the direct cost of profit, which breaks down why white men are exalted in cinema and the occurrences of shitty race swaps. It's obvious that rich white dudes would be interested in cinematically sucking themselves off, as making white men the literal cream of the crop would empower their social status, but it also makes sense that if they just wanted profit from appealing to minorities and liberals, they would just include shitty diversity placements that continue to perpetuate white supremacy or bring people of color more heat than benefit. Cause I've shitted on how casting a black woman as a Viking chief from Scandinavia doesn't make much sense for a historical piece, but the people I should have really shit on was the rich white dudes who created and cast the show. So at the end of the day, big corporations do what big corpos do: profit. If they're pushing diversity in film, it isn't for woke reasons or even for representations, but rather profit. After all, while white people in the past were pretty much the only people who had the rights and disposable income to afford going to the movies, nowadays, minorities are a bit less oppressed while having a bit more wealth needed to enjoy cinema and film. And with the stats telling a message that white people will soon become a minority in the future, and that marginalized populations are getting larger and larger, it's very apparent to me at least that the shift to add more diversity in films is a method to attract a bigger audience for the sake of money. So if you've ever found yourself thinking that big-ass corporations who are literally the epitome of capitalistic greed might care about a woke agenda, then think again. Because if companies were really empathetic to the cause, then big-ass corporations wouldn't be canceling fire insurance in California as we speak. In fact, I don't even know why these white supremacists are crying online. Most of these shows with race swap characters are still as white supremacist as ever. As such, race swapping for the most part obviously isn't woke. Yes, these films with race swap characters may increase racial diversity on screen, but are these films truly that woke if they're suggesting that every colored woman is in need of a purifying bleached seed? Or that the only hope of achieving romance for yellow and brown dudes is through a connection to whiteness? Be real with me, where is the wokeness in these messages? And much like all those examples of Asian dudes getting cast as male romance leads, it's not done for diversity, but to communicate that men of color need white adjacency for romantic viability. Which, by the way, in case you need reminding, is fucking impossible for most of us, as you can't change your race, and many of the Asian male romance leads seen on TV didn't attain whiteness through any individual efforts or accomplishments, but by literally being born white. So what's the core message shown to men of Asian descent then? The message is that you're cooked! Just give up, dude. You might as well click off this video because I ain't got solutions for you. If you really want some romance and love, then you better pray you're reincarnated as a white dude in your next life because you're literally Okay, for all the Asian homies watching, theatrics aside, you're not completely cooked. Because just like how race swapping isn't solely good or bad, things are quite nuanced. So the intent of this video isn't to just depress you, but to raise awareness towards Asian male representation, as giving an explanation of supplementation and the examples of positive and negative forms of race swapping could allow more awareness towards which films y'all should actually spend your energy crashing out over. Thankfully, although this topic is pretty glum, we shouldn't ignore any progress made. And although whitewashing has gone from one form to another, it should still be understood that less overtly racist depictions of Asian men are still preferable to outright yellowface. Of course, I'm not suggesting that what we have currently is enough, so please keep molding with me. However, films with Asian representation have seen an upward trend, and media featuring peeps of Asian descent consumed by Western audiences aren't solely limited to Western productions. Due largely to the proliferating popularity of Asian culture, leading to a globalization of Asian cinema and film, nowadays not only are Asian peeps depicted more fairly, but more represented than ever. So going back to the study conducted over 25 films produced since 1993, we can observe a gradual increase in all categories of Asian representation over the generations. However, while we do see gradual improvement, it should also be noted that the number of roles still do not pass 10 occurrences. Plus, it is also significant that the biggest jump in roles we've seen is in Asian women being cast as supporting characters, and I'll probably save getting more into this stuff for another video, but as stated in part 4, it's probably because of some white bullshit where they're placed as the love interest of a white dude, but still, even if shitty, at least we're seeing some improvement in representation. But don't be mistaken, these increases in representation aren't just a result of passing time and more people getting less anti-Asian, but rather of collective passion and effort advocating for more Asian representation. Because while people today get to enjoy watching anime and K-dramas without others batting an eye, I still remember when people used to get bullied over it and us OGs had to watch that shit miniaturized in the corner of a YouTube video with each episode split into 6 parts. So despite centuries of media perpetuating men of Asian descent as unattractive, Asian men have seen an increased role in cinema over time. And while change may be slow, Asian representation in other aspects such as cuisine and music have also started looking up. But these changes aren't solely good, because I'm pretty sure that a lot of it is more fetishization than genuine attraction. Plus, Asian dudes aren't really a monolith, so while East Asians and light-skinned bastards like me probably have it easier than before, that doesn't really hold true for South Asians, which is why people like Indian, Pakistani, and Bangladeshi men are still viewed atrociously, and why anti-brown racism is literally so bad it's not just ignored but universally tolerated. And while we can increase representation and use methods such as race swapping to improve these issues, we should be careful to know how these race swaps spread certain perceptions of people of color. So in my opinion, race swapping should be viewed like a knife. You can either use it to cook up some scrumptious food, or if you're from the UK, you can stab someone to death with it. At the end of the day, it's neither a good or a bad thing, but simply a tool. A tool that was rooted in perpetuating racism? Yes. A tool that is still used to primarily marginalize oppressed people while pushing the notion of white supremacy? Also yes. But also a tool that can be occasionally utilized by talented minorities to reimagine themselves with additional subtleties towards their existence within a white society. And that's called nuance. Unfortunately, nuance isn't often appreciated, since most people would find it more entertaining if I just screamed down the mic crashing out against either race swapping or the people opposed to it. But if you're trying to learn and understand actual issues, as well as figure out methods with which to solve them, then this is what you get. Which is why academia tends to be a bunch of book nerds just reading and writing paid-walled articles that don't really contribute to practical solutions. And I'm not hating just to hate, I'm guilty of this too, as my framework of analysis is rooted in academia. Which is why if you watch multiple of my videos, you'll probably notice that I tend to be good at theory crafting, research, analysis, and developing frameworks to dissect and reinterpret complex issues, but utter trash at providing tangible solutions. Like, how do you even solve anti-Asian propaganda desexualization? It's easy enough to say that we need more and better nuanced depictions of Asian characters on screen, but how do we actually accomplish that? Join a gym and fan club? Hold a casting director at gunpoint and force them to choose Asian actors for roles? I don't fucking know. The easiest way to make our feelings known is obviously through public outcry, except people are already calling for more diversity. And while adding to that voice is helpful, unless we get more specific, it might just cause more examples of shitty race swaps. So my hope in this video is that it will teach on the nuances of representation and how specifics of marginalized representation can lead to a wide range of effects, from uplifting people of color to subconsciously communicating that we should venerate whiteness. And in doing so, we can learn what forms of diversity to ask for and what types of representation we should instead reject. Of course, that doesn't really solve the issue with pre-existing films of bad representation or those currently being made. And for those instances, the best action is probably just to avoid watching those films. But doing so might send the wrong message, as a show with a Asian romance lead bombing at the box office could be interpreted by higher-ups not that we're unsatisfied with yellow and brown peeps being used to desexualize us and to push white supremacy, but by the mere presence of Asian characters themselves. Plus, Mizu's cool as fuck, bro. Don't you want to see whether she gets to London and kills her father? I mean, as good as Blue Eye Samurai currently is, I can't be the only one waiting in anticipation to see if it ends up perpetuating some whitey bullshit, right? And in a similar vein, you can't really know whether a movie is actually harmful or learn from analyzing examples of problematic depictions unless you actually watch those films. Which again leads us to the conundrum of figuring out where to go now. At the end of the day, consensus is easy while pushing for progress is harder, as most people in the past supported slavery even though we know that was some fuck shit now. But they were able to support horrible laws because it was simply what had existed around them. Similarly, most people in America aren't going to support transgressive representation for people of color, not only because white supremacy has existed since the foundations of America, but because most Americans are white and actively benefit from marginalized oppression. So if you want change, you're gonna have to risk your neck a bit to push the Overton window, which is why I'm gonna keep posting despite all my videos bombing. Because if I have to be made uncomfortable watching countless films that desexualize yellow and brown dudes, then I'm gonna teach y'all to be uncomfortable whenever you see it too. And if you don't like that, then that's just too bad. I already did it, and that's just a trade-off you get from watching my content. So if after watching this video, you're no longer able to enjoy problematic films as much as you used to, then that just sucks. If you want to avoid that discomfort, then do something about representation. Thankfully, I did my part in this fight by making this video and spreading awareness, allowing me to push the burden of solving this issue onto y'all. And you can't just copy my video essay, because that's just fucking plagiarism, which leaves you, my dear viewer, with a few options. All of them being to subscribe, like, and share this fucking video. Doing so not only helps me pop off and spreads awareness, but more importantly, it helps you feel less guilty for not doing anything. Don't you feel any white guilt? Don't you want to support small content creators? Don't you want to be anti-racist and fight against white supremacy? Then do all the things I said earlier and empty all your fucking wallets into my Patreon. Alright, goodbye.